seeing a stronger need for contextualization, Valli and Holgersson explored the concept of gentrification along the Swedish case. They used the political economy framework to overcome the dichotomy between universalization and particularism. Using the example of the Swedish middle city, Gothenburg, they identified three major shifts in Swedish housing and urban policy: marketization of rental housing, tenure inequality, and entrepreneurial urbanism in post-industrial cities. Financialized housing careers built on the premise that the housing market will keep on growing are widely encouraged in Sweden, which leads to questions that are not only economically and politically relevant, but also sociologically significant, since they introduce new imaginations of the proper urban dweller. Valli and Holgersson argue that while displacement is taking place in many low-income Swedish neighborhoods nowadays, the phenomenon must be divorced from the concept of gentrification. Gentrification, they argue, itself is helpful when taken as an entry rather than an endpoint, because it serves to link different phenomena that are, however, not identical to gentrification itself. Dr. Berndt reflected on 3 points. What exactly is the use of gentrification in the analysis of the Swedish housing market? Do we really need the concept to understand what's going on in this particular case? Also, what is the role of scale? Many gentrification processes are studied on the neighborhood scale, but if we shift the scale, we might see in other places, such as the specific types of tenure or built environments. Lastly, what happens instead of gentrification? Holgersson and Valli also pondered the question of so-called ungentrifiable areas. So there might be a discourse of gentrification, but not the reality of it. They also remind us that gentrification has turned into a battle cry that cannot be easily dismissed by critical scholars. So we still need to engage with the concept without necessarily saying that that is what we're seeing. In the next presentation, Orhan and Yücel set out to examine how gentrification practices are experienced in the village. Interrogating the gentrification nature nexus along the tensions between urban and rural lifestyles, they borrow from scholars such as Edward Soya, Neil Smith, and Lees and Davidson. Defining gentrification along the lines of capital flow rather than class composition and physical displacement, they argue that gentrification in rural areas is a manifestation of accumulation processes and practices in urban areas. Studying two villages in Anatolia, they show how upper classes, especially Istanbul's intellectual elite, rediscovered, so to say, the area of Domatia in Anatolia. Practices such as gating, but also other urban habits, such as feeding stray cats, continue. In conclusion, Yücel and Orhan argue that gentrification is not always tied up with displacement. It can also happen as a result of old dwellers simply not being able to move back because of an interim property transfer. Dr. Berndt put the relation between the concepts and the case up for discussion. Is this a case confirming what we already know, or is there something in there that contradicts findings on gentrification or urban-rural migration? How is this, for example, connected to other forms of micro-investments, such as we have seen in the early 1980s across cities such as New York? Another question is that of displacement. Can the case of Domatia be understood as a case of new-built gentrification? Lastly, how can we conceptualize the different lifestyle practices in the village and gentrification as a cultural project? At the end of the morning session, we were left with the question, what then is actually gentrification? Not an easy one to answer. Dr. Berndt emphasized several aspects, reaching from social change to the benefit of more powerful classes, direct or exclusionary displacement, and maybe most significantly, the capital's logic behind the process that distinguishes gentrification from other processes of forced displacement, such as, for example, ethnic cleansing. After the break, we continued with Elton John's paper and the concept of commodification. Focusing on public space commodification, he explores how the concept of commodification is utilized beyond the realm of housing and stretched beyond the classical Marxian understanding. He identifies commodification as an action and process with an open-ended outcome. Referring to Lefebvre, Chan suggests that the commodification of urban land has turned the city into an abstract space of consumption and exchange value. He argues that scholars such as Appadurai and Esping Anderson provide useful extensions to the concept of commodification, laying focus on intention rather than result. Chan suggests that commodification is an issue of level and degree rather than something that is just there or not. He defines commodification as tied up with an economic logic or something thought about in terms of exchange value rather than it necessarily having an exchange value. Anything can be commodified, even if it is not a commodity yet. As such, a public space can be more or less commodified and must always be read in relation to other public spaces, even without change of ownership. Dr. Band, in response, emphasized the importance of tackling commodification as a concept to understand the city. While he was also warning of concept stretching, he urged us also not to stray away from a specific concept and use other concepts and link them to make sense of a complex process. The last paper of the morning session by Johann Pries engaged with the semiotic side of urban redevelopment in the city of Malmö. Using the term repackaging, Pries asks why planners obscure some parts of urban life while hyper-focusing on others, leading the audience to a series of critical urban theories repackaged by urban planners in the service of urban redevelopment, such as public encounters, in-between space, relational mobility, and connected geographies. Pries suggests that planners tightly hold on to their blind spots, such as, for example, housing inequality, the already existing complex connections and relationalities within the city, and racism. The result is frequently that all kinds of spaces in the city are subsumed under the gaze of the white middle class Malmö dweller, which means new connections are forced through the establishment and reconfiguration of new boundaries and frontiers that are often highly exclusionary. Dr. Band emphasized the importance of linking scholarship to practice and that we should worry about the instrumentalization of our work, while at the same time reflecting on the neoliberal academia and the inability of young scholars to actually look into the practice of urban planning or the problems of disenfranchised communities. He asked how far the situation Pries suggests is applicable to other places. For example, in some contexts, the state has not intervened at all in public spaces simply because there is no money or economic power to do so. So how much do we need to embed this story in the trajectory of the Swedish state with a long history of state intervention in public space and housing? Claudia?
This afternoon, we began with a presentation from Professor Miguel Martinez, who challenged us with the question, what does it mean to be critical in urban studies? Arguing that critical urban studies is not the new mainstream, as some have announced, Miguel reminded us that critical urban studies still needs to be carried out in a way that allows us to think outside the box and with Marxist concerns in mind, where the relationship between society, state, and capital is at the forefront of our scholarly concerns. Other strategies and priorities include embracing intellectual curiosity and being precise with concepts, engaging with mainstream urban studies as well, contributing towards academic freedom by challenging neoliberal and utilitarian academia, fostering cooperation inside and outside academia, doing research according to political relevance and in a way that empowers marginalized groups through collaborative approaches, widening the scope of critical urban studies through activist research and learning from emancipatory movements. We then had presentations that challenge our understandings of three concepts: occupation, the urban-rural binary, and public space. With a paper titled Makeshift Urbanism by Occupation, Saila Maria Saristo first took us to Portugal, to the housing states of the Lisbon metropolitan area, to argue that occupations cannot be simply be divided into needs-based on the one hand and politically motivated on the other hand. Through a careful analysis of everyday practices and strategies of survival amongst a group of mostly single mothers that have occupied empty apartments, Saila Maria showed us that their actions can be seen as an example of everyday politics to secure the right to housing. As the occupiers navigate a difficult housing situation and rely on networks to access apartments and make them livable, the complex process of informality becomes apparent. Informality, as Saila Maria argued, and here I quote, implies also extra legal practices, even if the borders between formal and informal are blurred in practice, end of quote. Through her case, we see that it's not only the occupiers that engage in informality, but also the state. Finally, not forgetting about methods, Saila Maria reminded us of the importance of activist research through her use of engaged ethnography, which resonates with the point that Professor Martinez made during his mini keynote. On a different note, and moving our gaze towards Asia, Nick Smith argued China has been mostly absent from debates within Anglophone urban studies, even though it is the perfect example of what the field is experiencing at the moment. A situation where, to quote Nick, the urban is both more relevant and more elusive than ever, end of quote. Yet Chinese urbanization has been ignored because it has been judged as either exceptional and therefore difficult to engage, to integrate to Western debates, or just derivative of what we already know. However, these ideas need to be challenged both within Chinese and non-Chinese scholarship, explaining that there is an intrinsic contradiction embedded in Chinese urbanization, a mismatch between the state-imposed urban categories and the country's actual urban processes. Nick argued a process of reconceptualization is needed to understand the urban in contemporary China. A second point that Nick made is the bold proposition, and here I quote, that the fundamental divide in contemporary urban studies is not epistemological, ontological, or methodological. It is political, end of quote. Nick argued that there is a difference between what he refers as the politics of conceptualization and an objective representation of urbanization. In other words, a form of representational fidelity, as he calls it, depends on establishing a difference between the political and the descriptive. Having this difference in mind forces us to remember another point also raised by Professor Martinez. The creation and a use of concept needs to be done with political objectives in mind. Continuing the conversation about the need to rethink our concepts, Catalin Berescu revisited public space to share some thoughts about its relationship to urban planning and architecture in what he referred as a process of disentangling the semiotic machinery around it, making the point that we cannot ignore the difference and the blurriness between the public and the private. Catalin also argued we can also not treat public sphere and public space as synonyms. Reflecting around dichotomies, Catalin brought in Habermas, Ostrom, Foucault, Giddens to find connections and contradictions between the public and the carceral and the communal and the private. Catalin's essay brought to mind the importance of being precise with concepts as raised by Professor Martinez, and in a way reminded us of Henri Lefebvre's warning raised in the production of space of the dangers of fetishizing and compartmentalizing space and not establishing a distinction with place. In short, all presentations raise three important questions that we can take with us. First, how do we as researchers deal or work with the tension between particularity and generalizability in order to advance knowledge? The second question is related to the ontology itself of urban studies and the issues attached to epistemology. Who produces knowledge and how is this related to power? And finally, how do we deal with the strengths and limitations of working with dichotomies, for example, the urban-rural or the public-private? How can a process of reconceptualization help us break away from the limits of certain binaries? Defne, back to you.
Yes, I would like to end the workshop here. So we are almost done. So this was a very exciting journey for all of us. We also would like to thank the whole team, also our administrative team, Freya and Will, who have supported us in the background. We are so happy to be part of this conversation throughout the four